Thomas Reed knew something was wrong when Helen did not ask about his day. For nearly 40 years, she had asked the same question every evening. Sometimes she listened to the answer. Sometimes she only nodded while carrying plates to the sink. But she always asked. That night, the dining table was set for two. Roast chicken, green beans, and potatoes sat between them. The food was warm. The house was quiet. Nothing looked unusual except the small envelope beside Helen's glass. Thomas removed his tie and sat down. The quarterly review ran long. He said, "They want me to stay through the transition period. 2 more years. Possibly 3. Helen cut a potato in half. Thomas waited for her to respond. She did not. It would increase the pension, he continued, and they need someone experienced while the new system is introduced. Helen placed her fork down. I rented an apartment. Thomas looked at her. What? I signed the lease this afternoon. For several seconds, the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. Thomas glanced toward the envelope. This is about the anniversary. No. I know I forgot to make the reservation, but we can still go away. We could take the trip to Maine you mentioned. Thomas, I have vacation days. I can clear a week. Please stop. Her voice was not loud. That made him more uneasy. Helen had been angry with him before. She had raised her voice, cried, closed doors, and gone to bed without speaking. This was different. She looked tired. But certain. When are you moving? He asked. Saturday. He stared at her. That gives us 3 days. I've been trying to leave for years. Thomas leaned back. He did not understand the sentence. They had eaten breakfast together that morning. Her coat still hung beside his in the hallway. Their framed walk. People did not end 40 years of marriage during a normal dinner. What happened? He asked. Helen gave a small, painful smile. You still think something had to happen? Something must have. No. That is the problem. Thomas looked at the food between them, still releasing steam. Helen followed her hands. When I told you I was lonely, you suggested joining a club. I thought you wanted more activities. When I said I missed you, you arranged a weekend away and spent half of it answering emails. There was an emergency. There was always an emergency. Thomas felt the familiar need to organize the conversation. He began listing solutions. Marriage counseling, a reduced schedule, a long vacation, selling the house and moving closer to their daughter. Helen listened until he finished. Then she said, You are trying to fix this before you understand it. I am trying to save our marriage. No. You are trying to stop a problem. Thomas tightened his jaw. What is the difference? I am your wife. Thomas. Not a problem. The words settled heavily between them. He wanted to defend himself. He had never cheated. He had never disappeared for days. He had paid every bill, planned for retirement, repaired the house, and made sure Helen never had to worry about money. He had done what a husband was supposed to do. Hadn't he? I worked for us, he said. I know. I gave this family everything. You gave us security? Helen looked directly at him. But you kept yourself somewhere else. Thomas lowered his eyes. He remembered hospital waiting rooms where he had answered calls, birthday dinners he had left early, conversations he had shortened because he was tired. At the time, each decision had seemed temporary, necessary, responsible. Helen opened the envelope and slid several papers across the table. They were not divorce documents. Not yet. They were details for the apartment and a list of household items she intended to take. Thomas scanned the page. The blue chair, the bedroom lamp, half the dishes, her books. The ordinary objects made the separation feel more real than any legal document could have. Is there someone else? He asked. Helen's expression hardened for the first time. No. Then why can't we work on this? I have been working on it alone. Thomas looked at her. She picked up her fork again but did not eat. I don't hate you, she said. That would almost be easier. He said nothing. I just cannot spend the rest of my life waiting for you to arrive. Thomas wanted to tell her he was sitting directly across from her, but he finally understood that was not what she meant. On Saturday morning, Helen carried the last box to her car. Thomas stood in the doorway. He had offered to help. She had declined. Before leaving, she turned toward him. I hope one day you learn that listening is not the same as waiting for your turn to speak. Then she drove away. Thomas remained on the porch until the car disappeared. Inside, the house looked almost unchanged. That was the cruelest part. The clock still ticked. The heating system still ran. His briefcase waited beside the stairs. Everything continued working. Only the life inside it had ended. For the first week after Helen left, Thomas went to work earlier than usual. He arrived before the lights on the executive floor were fully on, placed his briefcase beside the same desk he had used for 12 years, and opened his email before removing his coat. The routine helped. At the office, no one asked whether the house felt empty. No one noticed that he had begun eating dinner from vending machines because he could not stand sitting alone at the table. People brought him problems, and Thomas solved them. A delayed systems upgrade, a staffing conflict, a vendor threatening to cancel a contract. Each issue came with numbers, deadlines, and clear consequences. Unlike marriage, work always told him what needed to be done. 2 weeks later, Thomas attended a transition meeting with 6 younger managers. A large screen displayed the new operations platform his department had spent years building. A man named Aaron, 31 years old, and recently promoted, stood at the front of the room explaining how the system would reduce the company's dependence on senior managers. Thomas listened without moving. He had approved the budget. He had reviewed the design. He had trained Aaron. Now the presentation described a future in which people like Thomas would no longer be necessary. When Aaron finished, the chief executive turned toward him. Thomas, we would still like you to remain through the transition. 2 years, possibly longer. Your institutional knowledge is invaluable. Invaluable. The word should have reassured him. Instead, Thomas looked around the table and understood something he had refused to consider. The company did not need him. It needed what he knew until someone else learned it. After that, the meetings would continue. The reports would still be produced. Another person would sit in his office. For 40 years, Thomas had treated work as proof that his presence mattered. Now he saw how easily the machine could continue without him. What happens if I decline? He asked. The chief executive smiled. Assuming he was negotiating. We can discuss compensation. I'm not asking about compensation. The room became quiet. Thomas folded his hands. I'm leaving. Aaron stopped taking notes. The chief executive leaned forward. At the end of the year? Today. The decision surprised Thomas as much as everyone else. He had not planned it. He had not discussed it with Sophie. He had not calculated the effect on his pension. For once, he acted before creating a list. Human Resources spent the afternoon trying to slow him down. They offered reduced hours, a consulting role, and a 6-month leave. Thomas declined each option. At 4:30, he packed his office. There was less to take than he expected. A framed photograph of Sophie at 16, a pair of reading glasses, 3 notebooks filled with schedules no one would need, a silver pen Helen had given him on his 50th birthday. At the bottom of a drawer, he found an anniversary card she had written years earlier. The front showed 2 people sitting together on a bench. Inside, Helen had written, I hope one day we learn how to be still together. Thomas read the sentence twice. He could not remember receiving the card. He placed it in the box. Several employees gathered near the elevator to say goodbye. Some looked genuinely upset. Others seemed uncomfortable, as if sudden retirement might be contagious. Aaron shook his hand. I don't know how we'll do this without you. Thomas almost gave him instructions. Instead, he said, You'll learn. The elevator doors closed. By 5:15, He was driving home in rush-hour traffic, with the cardboard box on the passenger seat. He had expected relief. What he felt was fear. The next morning, Thomas woke at 5:45. He shaved, dressed in a white shirt, and tied a dark blue tie before remembering he no longer had an office. He stood in the bedroom mirror, fully dressed, with nowhere to go. The house was silent. Helen's side of the closet remained half empty. Thomas went downstairs, made coffee, and opened his laptop. His company email had already been disabled. He refreshed the page 3 times. Then he called Sophie. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, is everything all right? I left the company." A long pause followed. "You retired?" "I resigned." "Yesterday?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I'm telling you now." "That is not the same thing." Thomas heard Helen in the sentence. He tightened his grip on the phone. "I decided it was time. You lost Mom and quit your job within 2 weeks. I did not lose your mother. She chose to leave." Sophie went quiet. Thomas immediately regretted the words, but pride kept him from taking them back. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'll make a plan." For the next month, planning became the only thing he did. He created retirement budgets. He reorganized the garage. He sorted old tax records. He researched volunteer positions but applied to none. Each task filled an hour, then returned him to the same silence. One evening, he found himself sitting in the dark living room, wearing the shirt and trousers he had put on that morning. He had spoken to no one all day. On the coffee table lay a local property magazine that had arrived with the mail. Thomas opened it without interest. Near the back was a small advertisement: 18-acre farm for sale. Orchard. Greenhouse. Small house. Needs work. The photograph showed peeling paint, tall grass, and a crooked chicken coop. Nothing about it looked peaceful. Thomas tore out the page. For the first time since leaving the office, he had somewhere to go. The farm was smaller than Thomas expected. He had imagined long fields disappearing toward the horizon. But the property ended at a line of old maples less than half a mile from the road. 18 acres. A one-story farmhouse. A leaning chicken coop. A greenhouse with several broken glass panels. Beyond it stood a neglected orchard, its branches tangled and heavy with dead wood. Thomas parked beside the porch and checked the advertisement again. The photograph had been generous. The white paint had peeled from most of the house. One gutter hung loose above the kitchen window. Tall grass covered the stone path, and a rusted wheelbarrow rested upside down near the barn. A woman stood beside the front door holding a ring of keys. She wore faded jeans, a green jacket, and work boots covered in dried mud. "Thomas Reed?" she asked. "Yes." "June Parker." Thomas looked toward the road. "I was expecting an agent." "You got one." She unlocked the door. "I own the farm store in town. The seller lives in Arizona and asked me to show the place." Inside, the house smelled of dust and cold wood. The rooms were small but solid. The kitchen had old cabinets, a stained sink, and a stove from another decade. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with cracked floor tiles. Thomas opened cupboards, checked windows, and wrote notes in a leather folder. June watched him. "You inspect every house like this?" "I prefer to know what I'm buying." "You're buying repairs?" Thomas ignored the comment. Outside, he measured the greenhouse with his eyes. "How much would it cost to replace the glass?" "Depends." "On what? Whether the frame survives winter?" Thomas wrote that down. They continued toward the orchard. Many trees had not been pruned in years. Moss covered the trunks. Fallen apples from the previous season had rotted into the ground. "How many productive trees?" he asked. June shrugged. "Maybe 20. Maybe 40 after some work." "That is not very precise." "Trees rarely are." Thomas glanced at her. At the chicken coop, one wall leaned outward, and the roof had a hole large enough to see the sky. He circled the structure slowly. "It should be replaced." "It could be repaired." Replacement would be more efficient. For a company, maybe. Thomas closed his folder. What exactly is wrong with this property? June looked around. Nothing. If you know what it is. And what is it? Work. The answer irritated him. I'm not looking for a vacation home. That is good. Because this place won't give you one. She leaned against a fence post. You from the city? Yes. Farmed before? No. Raised animals? No. Used a chainsaw? Not recently. June studied his polished shoes. Ever cleaned a chicken coop? Thomas did not answer. She nodded toward his folder. You're trying to buy peace with a checklist. I'm trying to make an informed decision. Same thing. The way you're doing it. Thomas looked back at the farmhouse. He had enough money from the sale of the marital home to buy the property without a mortgage. The taxes were manageable. Renovations would cost more than he liked, but less than a house near Sophie. More importantly, no room here belonged to Helen. No chair carried her shape. No silence echoed with the life they had lost. When can I close? He asked. June straightened. You haven't seen the well? I'll have it inspected. The drainage? I'll hire someone. The orchard? I'll bring in a specialist. June gave him a tired smile. There it is. What? You think every difficulty is a service you can purchase. Thomas placed the folder beneath his arm. Most problems have solutions. Some do. And the rest? The rest teach you what kind of person you are. Thomas dismissed the remark. He signed the preliminary agreement that afternoon. 3 weeks later, he returned with a moving truck. New tools, boxed furniture, and a 6-month improvement plan printed in color. He taped the schedule to the kitchen wall. Month 1, plumbing, electrical work, structural repairs. Month 2, greenhouse restoration. Month 3, orchard pruning and soil preparation. Month 4, purchase chickens and establish vegetable beds. Month 5, first local sales. Month 6, full operation. The plan was clean, logical, measurable. Thomas stood in the kitchen and felt, for the first time in months, that his life had direction. Then he turned the faucet. The pipes groaned. Brown water sprayed from beneath the sink and flooded the cabinet. Thomas shut the valve and stepped backward. Outside, something crashed. He ran to the porch. A section of the chicken coop roof had collapsed into the yard. From the road, June's truck slowed as it passed. She lowered the window. First day, she called. Thomas looked at the water spreading across his kitchen floor. Yes. June nodded toward the printed schedule visible through the doorway. You may want to leave some blank spaces. Then she drove on. Thomas stood alone between the leaking sink and the broken coop. He looked at the 18 acres he had purchased to regain control of his life. Before sunset, the farm had already refused. By the end of the first week, Thomas's 6-month plan was already useless. The plumber discovered that the kitchen leak was only one part of a larger problem. Several pipes beneath the house had cracked during winter. The electrical inspector found damaged wiring near the greenhouse. The carpenter refused to repair the chicken coop until the ground beneath it was leveled. Every appointment created another expense. Every repair exposed something else. Thomas responded the only way he knew how. He created a new schedule. He divided the property into zones, assigned priorities, compared contractor estimates, and built a spreadsheet that tracked cost, progress, and delay risk. For 3 days, the plan gave him comfort. Then the plumber failed to arrive. The greenhouse contractor postponed the job by 2 weeks. A storm damaged another section of the coop roof. Thomas called each company repeatedly. He demanded revised dates and written explanations. At his old office, pressure had produced results. Here, people simply stopped answering. On Friday morning, June found him standing outside the greenhouse with his phone pressed to his ear. You look like you're firing someone, she said. I'm trying to get a contractor to honor an agreement. Who? Peter Lawson. June laughed. What is funny? Peter works when the weather, his back, and his wife all agree. That is not professional. No, it is Peter. Thomas ended the call. I cannot run this property if no one follows a schedule. June looked toward the orchard. The property is running. You are the one struggling. Thomas disliked her habit of turning simple problems into personal lessons. He entered the greenhouse. Several glass panels were broken, but the frame still appeared solid. Dead vines hung from wires overhead. Old planting tables leaned against the far wall. Thomas had planned to hire workers to clear it. Instead, he spent the morning removing debris himself. Within an hour, dust covered his shirt. A rusted nail tore his sleeve. When he lifted one rotten table, it collapsed in his hands and scattered wet soil across the floor. Thomas stepped back, breathing heavily. He had spent 40 years directing teams. Now he could not move one wooden table without making the mess worse. Near noon, an old pickup stopped beside the greenhouse. A tall man with white hair climbed out carrying a toolbox. I'm Ben Holloway, he said. I live over the hill. June sent you? No. I saw you fighting the door yesterday. I was not fighting it. Ben looked at the crooked frame. Did the door win? Thomas said nothing. Ben examined the greenhouse structure and pointed toward a warped support beam. You replaced the glass before fixing that? The first strong wind breaks it again. The contractor said the frame was stable. Contractor looked from the road. Thomas nodded reluctantly. Ben placed the toolbox on the ground. Hold this. For the next 2 hours, Thomas followed instructions. They removed damaged wood, straightened a metal brace, and secured the frame with temporary supports. Ben made him measure every cut twice. Thomas sawed one board too short. He reached for another. Ben stopped him. Use the short one somewhere else. It is the wrong size. It is the wrong size for this job. That does not make it useless. The sentence stayed with Thomas longer than he expected. By late afternoon, the greenhouse was still broken, but one section stood straighter. Thomas looked at the work. At this rate, restoration will take months. Ben closed his toolbox. Probably. I plan to finish it in 4 weeks. Did the greenhouse agree? Thomas almost argued. Then he noticed Ben smiling. The next problem arrived before sunset. The 6 hens Thomas had purchased that morning refused to enter the repaired section of the coop. They crowded together near the fence, making sharp, anxious sounds. Thomas tried to guide them inside with a broom. The hens scattered. He tried again. One flew directly into his chest. Ben, still standing beside his truck, watched in silence. Do you have advice? Thomas asked. Yes. Thomas waited. Stop chasing them. Ben placed feet inside the coop and moved away. Within minutes, the hens entered on their own. Thomas stared through the wire. They wasted 20 minutes. They are chickens. That is not an explanation. It is the only one they need. That evening, Thomas returned to the kitchen and looked at the printed schedule on the wall. Several deadlines were already crossed out. Costs had increased. Progress was behind. His first instinct was to print another version. Instead, he removed the paper. He folded it once and placed it inside a drawer. The next morning, Thomas woke before his alarm. Outside, the hens were already making noise. The damaged greenhouse reflected the first light. Water still dripped beneath the kitchen sink into a metal bucket. Nothing was finished. Nothing was under control. Yet for the first time since arriving, Thomas walked outside without checking a schedule. The farm had not become easier. He had simply stopped expecting it to obey. The eggs began disappearing during Thomas's second month on the farm. At first, he blamed the hens. He counted 6 eggs in the nesting boxes before breakfast and found only 4 by noon. The next day, 3 were missing. By the end of the week, nearly a dozen had vanished. Thomas checked the coop for cracks. He repaired the latch. He looked for signs of foxes, raccoons, or snakes. There were none. Only one thing bothered him. The eggs disappeared without broken shells or disturbed straw. Someone was taking them carefully. Thomas bought a motion-activated light and mounted it above the coop door. He also moved a chair beside the kitchen window and waited after dark. At 9:30, the yard remained still. At 10:15, he began to feel foolish. At 10:42, the light flashed on. A thin figure froze beside the coop. Thomas was outside before the boy reached the fence. "Stop." The boy ran. Thomas moved toward the gate and blocked the path. The boy could not have been older than 17. He wore a gray sweatshirt despite the warm night. A canvas bag hung from one shoulder. Thomas reached for it. The boy pulled away. "Give me the bag." "No. I can call the police." That stopped him. His face changed. Not with guilt, but fear. Thomas held out his hand. Slowly, the boy gave him the bag. Inside were 8 eggs wrapped in an old dish towel. Thomas looked at him. "You have been stealing from me." The boy stared at the ground. "What is your name?" "Caleb." "Caleb what?" "Moore." Thomas knew the name. Ben had mentioned a family living in a trailer beyond the Eastern Road. A mother who worked nights. 3 children. No father anyone had seen in years. "That does not make this acceptable," Thomas said. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I know." "Then why did you do it?" The boy said nothing. Thomas picked up his phone. Caleb looked toward the road. "My little sisters need breakfast." Thomas paused. "That is not an excuse." "I didn't say it was." The answer irritated him. Thomas had expected pleading or apology. Instead, Caleb stood with his shoulders rigid, prepared for punishment. "Where is your mother?" "At work." "What kind of work?" "Hospital laundry." "And there is no food in your house?" "There's food." Caleb hesitated. "Just not enough until Friday." Thomas looked at the eggs. He remembered years of company meetings where employees had presented shortages as figures on a screen. He had approved budgets, cut expenses, and told people to work within limits. There had always been a solution. But standing in the dark, he had no idea what solution belonged here. "You could have asked," he said. Caleb laughed once. It was not a happy sound. "People like you always say that after they catch someone." "People like me?" "People with full kitchens." Thomas almost sent him away. Instead, he asked, "Do you know how to repair fencing?" Caleb looked up. "Some." "Can you clean a chicken coop?" "Yes." "Use tools?" "Better than you." Thomas stared at him. Caleb's mouth tightened, as if he regretted the words. Thomas pointed toward the barn. "You will be here tomorrow at 7. "For what?" "To work." "I have school." "After school?" "Then 4 o'clock. Caleb looked suspicious. "You're not calling the police?" "You will repay what you took." "I don't have money." "I did not ask for money." Thomas handed him the bag. Caleb did not take it. "What is this?" "Tonight's eggs." "You just said I stole them." "You did." "Then why are you giving them back?" "Because your sisters still need breakfast." For the first time, Caleb's expression softened. Only slightly. The next afternoon, he arrived at 4:27. Thomas was waiting beside the coop. "You are late." "I came straight from school." "Then school ends too late." Caleb rolled his eyes. Thomas handed him a shovel. The boy worked without complaint. He removed dirty straw, repaired a loose board, and found the opening where rainwater entered beneath the back wall. Thomas watched him fit a scrap of wood into the gap. "You have done this before?" "My grandfather kept chickens." "What happened to him?" "He died." Caleb returned to his work. Thomas did not ask another question. At 6, he paid him in cash and gave him a carton of eggs. Caleb counted the bills. "This is too much." "It is the agreed rate." "We never agreed on a rate." "I did." Caleb almost smiled. Almost. He returned the following day. Then the day after that. Thomas told himself he needed the help. But each afternoon, He found himself looking toward the road before 4 o'clock, waiting for the boy to appear. The egg stopped disappearing. For the first time since moving to the farm, something had begun arriving instead. Caleb was late again on Tuesday. By 5 o'clock, Thomas had already cleaned the nesting boxes, carried feed to the coop, and repaired a loose hinge Caleb had promised to fix. At 5:30, irritation became certainty. The boy was unreliable. Thomas had seen it many times in younger employees. They accepted responsibility easily and disappeared when the work became inconvenient. At 6, he called Caleb's phone. No answer. He called again. Then a third time. Thomas told himself he was checking on the work, not the boy. Still. 20 minutes later, he was driving toward the Moore family's trailer. The front door stood open. 2 young girls sat on the steps, sharing an apple. One of them recognized Thomas from the egg cartons Caleb carried home. "He's not here," she said. "Where is he?" The older girl pointed toward the abandoned railway path behind the property. Thomas found Caleb half a mile away, sitting beside an overgrown drainage ditch. His backpack lay in the grass. There was dried blood beneath his nose and a purple mark forming along his cheekbone. Thomas stopped several feet away. "What happened?" Caleb wiped his face with his sleeve. "Nothing. That is clearly not nothing." "I'm fine." Thomas stepped closer. "Who did this?" Caleb looked away. Thomas felt the familiar machinery inside him begin to move. The school needed to be contacted. The parents of the other boy had to be identified. A medical examination might be necessary. If Caleb refused to cooperate, Thomas could call his mother or the police. Problems required action before they became worse. "Get in the truck," he said. "No. You may have a concussion." "I don't. You cannot know that." I said no. Thomas's voice hardened. "This is not a discussion." Caleb stood so quickly that Thomas stepped back. "You don't get to order me around everywhere. I am trying to help you." "No? You're trying to take over." "You were assaulted?" "I got into a fight." "That is worse." Caleb laughed bitterly. "See, you don't even know what happened. And you already decided what to do." Thomas opened his mouth. Caleb pointed toward the road. "You'll call the school. Then my mother. Then some counselor. Everybody will ask questions. And none of them will care what I say. They cannot help if you refuse to explain. Maybe I don't want help. Everyone needs help. Not your kind." The words struck harder than Thomas expected. "What does that mean?" Caleb looked directly at him. "It means you never listen. You wait for one sentence. Then you start fixing everything." Thomas went still. Helen had said almost the same thing at the dining table. He had spent weeks replaying her words, but only as evidence of what had gone wrong. He had not understood how deeply the habit lived inside him, even here, with a frightened boy bleeding beside a ditch. Thomas was more comfortable creating a response than sharing the silence. Caleb picked up his backpack. "I'm going home." Thomas could have stopped him. Instead, he sat down on the grass. Caleb stared at him. "What are you doing?" "Nothing." "That's weird." "Probably." Caleb remained standing for a moment, then slowly sat several feet away. Neither of them spoke. Thomas heard insects in the weeds and a truck moving along the distant road. The silence made him uncomfortable. He felt the urge to ask another question every few seconds. He forced himself not to. After several minutes, Caleb pulled at the loose thread on his sleeve. "A boy at school said my mom was trash." Thomas kept his eyes on the grass. Caleb continued. "He said everyone knows she leaves us alone at night." "Does she?" "She works." Thomas nodded. "I told him to shut up." "He didn't." "So you hit him?" "He hit me first." Thomas wanted to ask whether teachers had seen it. He wanted to explain consequences and suggest better choices. He said only, "That must have made you angry." Caleb looked at him, surprised. "Yeah." They sat quietly again. "My mom already thinks she's failing." Caleb said, If the school calls, she'll blame herself. Thomas finally understood that Caleb's fear was not punishment. It was adding one more burden to a woman already carrying too much. I won't call anyone tonight, Thomas said. Caleb studied him. You promise? Yes. What about tomorrow? Tomorrow. We decide together. The boy lowered his head. After a while, Thomas drove him home. Before Caleb got out, Thomas handed him a clean cloth wrapped around an ice pack. You still think I need a doctor? Caleb asked. Yes. You going to force me? No. Caleb opened the door, then paused. I'll come to the farm tomorrow. You do not have to. I know. The next afternoon, Caleb arrived at 4:12. Thomas was repairing the greenhouse door. The boy picked up a screwdriver and began helping without being asked. They worked side by side for nearly an hour before Caleb spoke. Thanks for not talking so much yesterday. Thomas looked at him. It was the closest thing to trust the boy had given him. For once, Thomas did not ruin it with an answer. By midsummer, the farm no longer looked abandoned. It did not look successful either. The greenhouse still had 2 missing glass panels covered with clear plastic. The farmhouse needed paint. Half the orchard remained tangled with dead branches. But the place had begun to breathe. 6 hens became 12. The vegetable beds held rows of tomatoes, beans, lettuce, and squash. Some plants grew well, others failed without explanation. Thomas stopped treating each failure like a personal insult. He learned to test the soil before planting. He learned that overwatering could kill as surely as drought. He learned to watch the sky. Most importantly, he learned to ask for help before a problem became expensive. Ben came twice a week to work in the orchard. He moved slowly, but he could examine a tree for several seconds and know which branches needed to be removed. Cut that one, he said one morning. Thomas looked up. That branch has fruit? It also blocks light from the center. Then we lose the apples. We lose some now, so the tree survives later. Thomas held the pruning saw against the branch, but hesitated. The old instinct returned. Protect the visible result. Avoid immediate loss. Ben noticed. You spent your whole life keeping everything, he said. How did that work out? Thomas cut the branch. It fell heavily into the grass, scattering several small apples. The tree looked emptier, but sunlight reached places that had been dark for years. Caleb was changing too. He no longer waited to be told what to do. He repaired broken latches, cleaned tools, and built a simple irrigation system from old hoses and discarded plastic pipes. Thomas had planned to buy a professional system. Caleb's version cost less than $50. It looks terrible, Thomas said. It works. Thomas turned on the water. A slow stream reached every vegetable row. He nodded. It works. That was the closest he came to admitting Caleb had been right. At the end of July, June invited Thomas to sell produce at the Saturday market outside her store. He resisted. We do not have enough volume. You have more tomatoes than you can eat. The sizes are inconsistent. They are tomatoes, not office chairs. Thomas selected only the best produce and arranged it in identical baskets. He printed price labels and created a sales sheet. At the market, customers ignored the sheet. They asked how the vegetables were grown. They wanted to know whether the hens were free range. One woman picked up a crooked cucumber and smiled. This one looks like my husband. She bought 3. By noon, nearly everything was gone. Thomas counted the money twice. The profit was small, less than he once earned during a single executive meeting. Yet the folded bills in his hand felt unusually real. June stood beside him. Disappointed? It is not much. No. She looked at the empty baskets. But people came back for what you grew. Thomas glanced across the road. Caleb was helping an elderly man carry vegetables to his car. Ben sat beneath a tree, arguing with someone about apple varieties. No one there knew Thomas as a director. No one cared how many people had reported to him. They knew him as the man from the small farm outside town. The following week, June asked whether he could supply 10 cartons of eggs and 20 pounds of tomatoes. Thomas began calculating immediately. He would need more hens, more feed storage, possibly another greenhouse. Caleb watched him write figures on the kitchen table. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Turning everything into a company." Thomas looked at the numbers. Caleb pointed outside. "We can grow more, but not all at once." Thomas wanted to tell him that growth required planning. Instead, he closed the notebook. "What do you suggest?" Caleb thought for a moment. "Fix what we already have." It was simple advice. Thomas followed it. They reinforced the coop instead of building another. They repaired the irrigation line. They planted only the greenhouse space they could maintain. The farm grew slowly, not according to Thomas's original schedule, according to what the land could carry. One evening, after the last hens had settled, Thomas stood outside the greenhouse. The air smelled of soil and tomato leaves. Caleb had gone home. Ben's truck had disappeared over the hill. Thomas realized he had not checked his old company's website in nearly a month. He no longer woke wondering who had replaced him. Tomorrow had its own demands. Feed the hens. Repair the west fence. Harvest beans before the heat. Small tasks. Necessary tasks. For most of his life, Thomas had believed importance came from scale. The farm was teaching him otherwise. A place did not need to be large to need him. A life did not need to look impressive to be full. Helen arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a silver car Thomas did not recognize. He was carrying a crate of tomatoes toward the greenhouse when he saw her turn into the driveway. For a moment, he stood still. She had told him she might visit to discuss the final divorce papers, but he had expected a phone call first. He set the crate down and wiped his hands on his trousers. Helen stepped out wearing a pale blue blouse and dark slacks. She looked almost exactly as she had the last time he had seen her, except there was less tension in her face. Thomas noticed that immediately. It hurt more than he expected. "You found the place?" he said. It was not difficult. Her eyes moved across the property. The repaired coop, the vegetable beds, the plastic-covered greenhouse. Caleb's irrigation lines stretched across the soil, like exposed veins. "This is smaller than I imagined," she said. "It is enough." Thomas heard the pride in his own voice. He began showing her everything. He explained how many eggs the hens produced each week. He described the market arrangement with June and the work he had done in the orchard. He showed her the new supports in the greenhouse and the section of roof he had repaired himself. Helen followed quietly. Thomas spoke faster. He wanted her to understand that he was not collapsing. He wanted her to see that leaving the company had not been a mistake. Most of all, he wanted her to see that he had changed. At the orchard, he pointed toward a row of newly pruned trees. "Ben says we may get a decent harvest next year." Caleb designed the irrigation system. "It looks rough, but it works." Helen looked at the pipes. "You sound happy?" Thomas paused. "I am productive." "That was not what I said." He looked away. They returned to the house. Thomas had prepared dinner before she arrived. Roasted chicken, potatoes, and green beans. The same meal Helen had served the night she told him she was leaving. He had not planned the similarity. When he noticed it, his hands became unsteady. Helen noticed too, but said nothing. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. For several minutes, Thomas continued talking about the farm. Costs, plans, expected yield, repairs still needed before winter. Helen listened until he reached for a notebook to show her the monthly figures. "Thomas." He stopped. "You are doing it again." "Doing what? Presenting your life like a report?" His hand remained on the notebook. "I thought you would want to know I am managing. I did not come to inspect you." The sentence embarrassed him. He closed the notebook. Helen placed a folder on the table. The lawyer sent the final agreement. Thomas looked at it but did not open it. "So this is why you came?" "Partly." "What is the other reason?" Helen studied him. I wanted to see whether you were all right. I am. I can see that. Thomas expected relief, but her calmness made him feel strangely disappointed. Some part of him had imagined she would see the farm, see the dirt on his hands, see the person he was becoming, and reconsider everything. He hated himself for hoping. Do you ever think we made the decision too quickly? He asked. Helen's expression changed. Not anger. Sadness. No. Thomas looked down. Outside. One of the hens made a sharp sound near the coop. He could have explained himself. He could have told Helen he now understood her complaints. He could have listed the ways he had improved. Instead, he remembered Caleb beside the railway ditch. You never listen. Thomas folded his hands. What made you feel most alone? Helen stared at him. He continued carefully. In our marriage, what did I do that made it worst? For a long moment, she did not answer. Then she said, You made me feel unreasonable for needing you. Thomas kept still. When my mother died, you arranged everything. Helen continued. The funeral, the paperwork, the house sale. You were efficient. Everyone praised you. Thomas remembered that week. He had believed he was protecting her. But at night, Helen said, I would cry, and you would tell me I needed sleep. Thomas felt shame rise in his chest. I did not know what to say. You could have said nothing. She looked at him directly. You could have stayed. Thomas did not defend himself. Helen spoke for nearly an hour. She described birthdays he had shortened, holidays interrupted by work, and evenings when she had tried to talk while he checked messages. None of the memories seemed dramatic alone. Together, they formed the life she had experienced beside him. When she finished, Thomas said, I am sorry. Helen waited. Perhaps she expected an explanation to follow. None came. I made you carry the loneliness quietly, he said. Then I blamed you for finally leaving. Helen lowered her eyes. The space between them remained painful, but it no longer felt like a battle. After dinner, she signed the final papers. Thomas signed beneath her name. At the door, Helen looked back toward the farm. You really are changing, she said. He felt hope rise again. Then she added, But change does not always mean going back. Thomas nodded. This time, he understood. Helen drove away before sunset. He stood on the porch until the road was empty. The visit had not saved his marriage. It had given him something smaller and perhaps more difficult. The truth. And for once, Thomas did not try to repair it. Ben did not arrive on Tuesday morning. Thomas noticed because Ben was never late. He usually appeared just after 7, driving the same faded pickup, carrying coffee in a dented metal cup. By 7:15, he would already be criticizing Thomas's pruning. At 7:30, Thomas called him. No answer. At 8, he drove over the hill. Ben's house stood beside a larger orchard, older and better established than Thomas's. His truck was parked near the shed. The driver's door was open. Thomas found him between 2 rows of apple trees. Ben lay on his side in the grass, one hand still gripping a pruning tool. Ben. Thomas dropped beside him. Ben's eyes were open, but his speech came out broken. Thomas called emergency services, then placed his jacket beneath Ben's head. You're all right? He said. He did not know whether it was true. Ben tried to move. Stay still. His fingers closed weakly around Thomas's wrist. Trees. What? Water. Thomas looked toward the irrigation line running through the orchard. Even while lying in the grass, Ben was thinking about the farm. The trees will be fine. Thomas said, I'll take care of them. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that Ben had suffered a mild stroke. He was expected to recover. But slowly, he would need therapy and several weeks of rest. Thomas visited that evening. Ben looked smaller in the hospital bed. My orchard, he said. I checked the water. South rows need thinning. Ben. Apples will split if I said I would handle it. Ben stared at him. Thomas added, more gently, you need to recover. The next morning, Thomas stood between the two farms with a notebook in his hand. His own tomatoes were ready for harvest. The greenhouse needed ventilation repairs. June expected 30 cartons of eggs by Friday. Ben's orchard required watering, pest checks, and early picking before the fruit became overripe. Thomas calculated the hours. There were not enough. Caleb arrived after school and listened while Thomas explained the situation. We can do both, Caleb said. No. We can attempt both. What's the difference? One is confidence. The other is poor planning. Caleb looked toward Ben's property. So we just leave his apples? Thomas did not answer. At his old company, the decision would have been obvious. Protect the operation under his responsibility. Avoid losses that could not be justified. Ben's farm was not his responsibility. Still, he remembered the greenhouse door Ben had helped repair before Thomas had learned how to ask. We divide the days, Thomas said. Mornings here, afternoons at Ben's. For the next 2 weeks, they worked until dark. Caleb handled the hens before school and repaired broken irrigation valves after returning. Thomas harvested vegetables at sunrise, delivered produce to June, then crossed the hill to Ben's orchard. The work was relentless. One afternoon, Thomas discovered blight on several tomato plants. He should have caught it earlier. By the time he removed them, the disease had spread through half a row. 3 days later, a tray of lettuce wilted in the greenhouse because Caleb forgot to open the vents. Thomas stood over the ruined plants, anger rising. How could you forget? I was spraying Ben's trees. You should have written it down. I was doing 2 jobs. So and I. Caleb threw the gloves onto the table. Then maybe we can't save everything. The words silenced Thomas. He looked at the damaged lettuce. Caleb was right. Helping Ben had a cost. That week, Thomas missed a market delivery and lost nearly a quarter of his tomato crop. The farm's income fell sharply. When Ben returned home, walking slowly with a cane, Thomas brought him to the orchard. The trees were alive. Most of the fruit had been picked. Crates of apples filled the shed. Ben touched one of the trunks with his good hand. You lost money, he said. Some. How much? Enough. Ben looked toward Thomas's farm. You should have protected your own place. Thomas thought of the years he had protected every account, every deadline, every business decision. He had been careful with money, careless with people. Before this, Thomas said, I spent my whole life making sure I never lost anything important at work. Ben waited. Thomas looked across the hill. I still lost my marriage. Ben lowered his eyes. Thomas continued. I can grow more tomatoes next year. He placed a hand against the rough bark of the nearest apple tree. You might not have had another orchard. Ben said nothing. But when Thomas turned to leave, the old man reached out and held his shoulder for a moment. It was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition. Thomas walked back toward his own farm as evening settled over the fields. Some of his crops were damaged. His income was lower. His plans had failed again. Yet, for the first time, the loss did not feel like failure. It felt like the price of becoming someone who stayed. Caleb received the job offer in late September. He did not mention it for 3 days. Thomas found the envelope folded beneath a wrench on the workbench. The return address belonged to a garage in the city, 40 miles away. When Caleb entered the barn, Thomas was still holding it. You opened my mail? It was already open. That does not mean you should read it. Thomas placed the letter on the bench. They want you to start next month. Caleb took off his work gloves. Yes. As an apprentice. Yes. The pay is not much. It is more than I make here. Thomas heard the challenge in the sentence. He turned toward the tractor they had been repairing. The city is expensive. I can stay with my cousin. You barely know him. I know him enough. Thomas looked at Caleb's face and felt something unfamiliar beneath his irritation. Fear. For months, Caleb had arrived almost every afternoon. His footsteps in the barn, his arguments, even the tools he left in the wrong places had become part of the farm's rhythm. Thomas had not realized how much he depended on that rhythm until it threatened to disappear. "What about school?" he asked. "I finish in June. The garage said I can work weekends until then." "And after graduation?" "I moved there." Thomas picked up the letter again. "There are better training programs. Not for someone with my grades. You could improve them." "I could. Or I could take a real job." "This is not a plan. It is an escape." Caleb's expression hardened. "From what?" "From responsibility." The words came too quickly. Caleb stared at him. "I work here every day. When it suits you. I helped save Ben's orchard. And nearly destroyed the lettuce crop." Thomas regretted the sentence immediately. Caleb stepped back as if Thomas had struck him. "I thought you said that was not all my fault." "It was not. You just used it anyway." Thomas opened his mouth, but the boy had already turned away. "You don't want me to stay because it is better for me." Caleb said, "You want me to stay because you need me." "That is not true." "Then why does every reason sound like yours?" Caleb left before Thomas answered. He did not return the next day, or the day after that. Thomas worked alone. He repaired the tractor belt Caleb had removed, but installed it incorrectly and had to start again. He carried feed to the coop in 2 trips. At the market, June asked where Caleb was. "Buzzy," Thomas said. June studied him. "What did you say?" "Why do you assume I said something?" "Because the boy leaves tools everywhere, but never work." Thomas told her about the job. June listened. When he finished, she said, "Sounds like a good opportunity." "He is 17. So, he is not ready." "Were you ready for your first job?" "That was different." "Because it was yours?" Thomas said nothing. June arranged apples in a basket. "You spent months teaching him to become capable. Now you are angry because he believes you." That evening, Thomas found Caleb behind the Moore trailer, replacing a tire on an old blue sedan. The car's body was rusted. One headlight was cracked. "You bought this?" Thomas asked. Caleb did not look up. $40. It may not survive the drive to the city. "I'm fixing it." Thomas crouched beside the wheel. "The brake line is corroded." "I know." "The rear tire is nearly bald." "I know." Thomas reached for the wrench. Caleb pulled it away. "I can do it." "I know." The boy paused. Thomas sat on the ground. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Thomas said, "You were right." Caleb continued working. "I was not thinking about what was best for you." Thomas said, "I was thinking about what your leaving would take from me." The wrench stopped. Thomas looked at the car. "I do not want this farm to become another place where someone has to shrink so I can feel secure." Caleb finally looked at him. "You think I should go?" "I think you should decide without carrying my fear." The words hurt as he said them. That was how Thomas knew they were honest. Over the next 2 weekends, they repaired the car together. Thomas replaced the brake line. Caleb rebuilt part of the exhaust system. Ben found 2 usable tires in an old shed. On the last Saturday before Caleb began work, Thomas handed him a small metal toolbox. Inside were wrenches, sockets, pliers, and the silver measuring tape Thomas had carried for years. Caleb lifted it. "This is yours." It was. "What if I mess up?" "You will?" Caleb frowned. Thomas added, "Then you will fix what you can and ask for help with the rest." Caleb closed the toolbox. "I'll come back on weekends." "You do not have to." "I know." This time, he smiled. On Monday morning, Thomas watched the blue sedan disappear down the road. The farm felt quieter without him, but the silence was different from the silence after Helen left. Thomas had not been abandoned. He had let someone go without turning love into a cage. For him, that was a new kind of staying. The warning arrived at 3 in the afternoon. June called, while Thomas was loading apples into crates behind the greenhouse. "Freeze tonight," she said. "Hard one." Thomas looked toward the orchard. The tree still held hundreds of apples. Several younger trees had not finished hardening for winter. The forecast that morning had predicted cool weather. Nothing more. "How low? 24? Thomas stopped moving. "At what time? After midnight?" He checked the sky. The afternoon was bright and almost warm. Nothing in the light suggested danger. "How certain?" "Certain enough that everyone in town is already moving." Thomas ended the call and went inside. He opened the weather report, checked 2 other sources, and began calculating. There were too many trees. Not enough covers. Not enough heaters. Not enough time. He called Caleb. No answer. He called again. Then he called Ben. The old man listened without interrupting. "You need smoke low to the ground." Ben said, "Vet stuff. Small controlled piles. Cover the youngest trees first. Pick everything right before dark." "I cannot do all of that alone." "No." Thomas waited for another instruction. Ben said, "So stop standing there alone." Thomas looked at the phone. For most of his life, asking for help had felt like admitting poor preparation. He had built his reputation on being the person others depended on. Now the farm needed more than he could give. Thomas called June, then Sophie, then Caleb again. By 5 o'clock, the first truck entered the driveway. June arrived with old orchard heaters from a farmer outside town. Behind her came 2 men, Thomas recognized from the Saturday market. Sophie arrived next with her husband and 2 children. She stepped from the car wearing boots that were not made for mud. "You said it was urgent?" she said. "It is." "What do we do?" Thomas almost began issuing orders. Instead, he spread Ben's hand-drawn orchard map across the hood of his truck. "We protect the young trees first. Then we harvest whatever we can." At 6:15, an old blue sedan came speeding down the road. Caleb got out before the engine stopped completely. "You started without me," he said. "You were working." "I left early." "You could lose the job?" Caleb lifted a bundle of tarps from the back seat. "Then stop wasting time." They worked as daylight faded. Sophie and the children picked apples into baskets. June placed heaters along the lower rows. Caleb repaired a fuel line on one of the burners, while Thomas and the market farmers dragged wet straw into small piles. Ben arrived just after dark. He was not supposed to drive yet. He stepped slowly from his truck with a cane in one hand. Thomas walked toward him. "You should be home. And you should know better than to argue with me during a freeze." Ben stood at the edge of the orchard, breathing heavily. He could not carry anything. But he directed the work. "More smoke near the eastern slope. Do not cover that tree so tightly. Move the heater away from the dry grass." By midnight, the temperature had fallen below freezing. Smoke drifted between the rows, thick and bitter. Frost formed on the grass. Thomas's hands had gone numb inside his gloves. The orchard looked like a battlefield. Small fires glowed beneath metal barrels. Sheets and tarps covered the youngest trees. People moved through smoke carrying buckets, ladders, and fuel. One heater failed near the south row. Caleb knelt beside it, coughing. "Fuel valve is blocked." Thomas crouched with him. "Can you repair it?" "Not fast enough." The nearest trees were already collecting frost. Thomas looked toward the greenhouse. They had one portable propane heater inside. Removing it would risk the vegetables. Leaving it meant losing part of the orchard. For a moment, the old calculations returned. Which crop was worth more? Which loss could be justified? Then Sophie's youngest daughter ran toward them, carrying a blanket. "Grandpa, where does this go?" Thomas looked at the people spread across the farm. They were not there because the apples were profitable. They were there because he had called. "Take the greenhouse heater," he told Caleb. "We may lose the tomatoes." "I know." Caleb held his gaze for a second, then ran. The cold deepened before dawn. Despite everything, several rows froze. Thomas could see it in the darkened leaves and brittle fruit. At sunrise, the workers stopped. Everyone looked exhausted. Smoke hung low over the orchard as pale light revealed the damage. Some trees had survived, others had not. The youngest row near the eastern fence was almost untouched beneath the covers. Most of the mature trees still held firm fruit. They had not saved everything. They had saved enough. June poured coffee from a large flask. Sophie sat on an overturned crate, with her children asleep against her shoulders. Ben leaned on his cane. Caleb stood beside Thomas, face blackened by smoke. "You know," Caleb said, "your original 6-month plan did not mention any of this." Thomas looked at him. "No. Bad planning." Thomas laughed. It surprised everyone, including him. The sound moved through the tired group, and soon June was laughing too. Thomas looked across the orchard again. He had once believed the farm would succeed if he became capable enough to control it. But the farm had survived the night because he had finally done something much harder. He had admitted that he could not save it alone. Thomas turned 66 on a clear October morning. He woke before sunrise, not because of an alarm, but because the hens had begun complaining outside his window. For years, his mornings had started with email. Now they started with noise from the coop, cold floorboards beneath his feet, and the smell of coffee in a kitchen that no longer felt temporary. The farm still carried damage from the early freeze. Several apple trees had lost entire branches. The last tomatoes were gone. One corner of the greenhouse remained covered with plastic because Thomas had decided the missing glass could wait until spring. A year earlier, unfinished work would have made him restless. Now he understood that a farm was never finished. It was only cared for. When Thomas stepped onto the porch, he found Caleb beneath the open hood of the old tractor. "You are here early," Thomas said. Caleb did not look up. "The fuel line is leaking again. You said you repaired it." "I repaired the part that was broken yesterday." Thomas smiled. The blue sedan stood beside the barn. Caleb's job at the city garage had become permanent, but he still returned most weekends. He no longer needed the farm in the same way. Thomas had learned not to take that personally. A second car entered the driveway. Sophie climbed out with her husband and children. The youngest ran toward Thomas carrying a paper bag. "We brought breakfast." "I already ate." She looked disappointed. Thomas corrected himself. "I can eat again." Inside the bag were cinnamon rolls, still warm. They ate on the porch while the sun rose over the orchard. Later that morning, people began arriving. June brought crates and a handwritten sign for the harvest table. Ben came with his cane and immediately complained that the apples had been arranged incorrectly. Several families from town brought children to the greenhouse, where Thomas had begun holding Saturday gardening lessons. The idea had started after Sophie's daughter asked why carrots grew underground. Now 12 children had their names painted on small wooden markers beside rows of vegetables. Near the barn stood a shelf filled with free produce. Thomas had resisted it at first. He worried people would take too much. June told him that generosity managed like an inventory system was not generosity. So Thomas stopped counting. The farm made little money, enough to cover feed, seed, repairs, and taxes. Not enough to make him important by his old standards. Yet people came. They bought eggs. They asked Ben about apple trees. They brought broken tools for Caleb to repair leaks. Sometimes they came only to sit near the greenhouse and talk. At noon, Helen arrived. Thomas saw her before she reached the porch. They had spoken several times since the divorce became final. Their conversations were no longer arguments, but they were not attempts to rebuild the marriage either. They had learned a different kind of honesty. Helen handed him a small wrapped box. "Happy birthday." Inside was a new leather notebook. Thomas ran his hand over the cover. "For your schedules?" she said. He laughed. "I do not make many anymore." "I know." For a moment, they watched Sophie's children chase each other between the trees. Helen looked toward the greenhouse. "You built something good here." Thomas shook his head. "Not by myself. The answer came naturally now. She noticed. "I am glad," she said. Thomas understood what she meant. She was glad he had changed. She was not asking to return, and he no longer needed her to. In the afternoon, his former company called. Aaron had been promoted again. A major project was failing, and they wanted Thomas to return as a consultant for 6 months. The money was generous. The work was familiar. For several seconds, Thomas imagined the office, the meetings, the clean certainty of being needed for what he knew. Then he looked through the kitchen window. Caleb was teaching Sophie's son how to hold a wrench. June was helping a woman choose vegetables. Ben sat beneath an apple tree, pretending not to be tired. Helen was laughing with Sophie near the porch. "I appreciate the offer," Thomas said, "but I cannot take it." After the call, he placed the new notebook on the kitchen table. He opened to the first page. For most of his life, Thomas had measured value through results. Promotions, savings, problems solved, people protected from uncertainty. The farm had taught him something far less comfortable. Love could not be managed. Loss could not always be repaired. And being useful was not the same as being present. Thomas had lost his marriage. He had walked away from the job that defined him. The farm had not given either one back. Instead, it had given him mornings that required his attention, work that could not be rushed, and people who did not need him to control their lives. They only needed him to show up. Thomas wrote one sentence in the notebook. "Stay where your presence matters more than your position." Outside, someone called his name. Thomas closed the book and walked toward the sound. For the first time in his life, he did not keep anyone waiting.